Psychedelics Today, going live with Vexta. So, yeah, here we go. Okay, Instagram's going. Beauty. So, let me figure out which way's up here on this live stream software, and then we're good to get started. So, I'm Joe Moore, CEO, co-founder of Psychedelics Today, joined by, sorry, I only know you by your last name on account of Instagram and knowing you from there.
It's
How do you say
totally
your first
fine.
name? Yvette?
Yvette. But yeah, everybody calls me Vexta,
Yvette.
so it is totally fine to address me as Vexta.
Perfect. So I was following you for a little while because I really liked your work, and then a mutual friend of ours, Melanie Curtis, who was recently on our show, said she was hanging out with you, and I was like, oh, cool. And then it's like, oh, let's get you on the podcast. I've had this interest in having a lot more artists and creatives on the show because I find the intersection of psychedelics and creativity and what we might be able to change and produce very interesting in concept. And artists, people actually putting acrylic or oils on surfaces or whatever kind of medium, like there's a lot of insight you all have gathered over a period of time. So thanks for being here, and I'm excited to dig in.
Thank you for having me. Yeah, I'm super excited to talk about these topics, and yeah, it's an honor to be on the podcast. It's something I was like, oh, I hope that happens one day, and then yeah, all the things conspired, and here we are. Yeah.
Well, I'm thankful. So let's hear a little bit about your kind of origin story before we dig into your work and some of your philosophies around art. You're living in New York, and you're interested in the psychedelic topic to some degree or another. So how did you end up in New York, and how did your art thing work for you in the early days? And was there a psychedelic angle that influenced it at all?
So many questions, and where to begin?
Yeah.
Yeah, so I like to touch on what we spoke about before we jumped on. I like to consider my work psychedelic informed. I'm not a visionary artist, and yeah, my background is the street art and graffiti movement, and that's how I ended up with an art career. Wasn't sort of intentional, and yeah, one thing led to another, and I'm very lucky to be an artist in resident at the World Trade Center here in New York City. I've been based here for about 10 years, over 10 years actually. And yeah, psychedelics it's been influential in my life since I was 17, and definitely propelled me into my career. So these two things kind of happened tangentially. My interest in psychedelics, and then realizing that's how I wanted to show up in the world was through my creativity, realizing that was my calling, the thing that I was really drawn to do. And then weaving my way into finding this, career through the street art and graffiti movement, which also was really culturally cutting edge in the same way that, psychedelics, I feel like now is really changing culture. Yeah. So I'm not sure if that answered your question, but
yeah. Well, I want to dig into the street art part. So
sure.
how were you just going around causing trouble, or how did you get involved in street art? Because it's a fascinating medium. It's a fascinating art form. And Denver has a pretty robust scene now, but how did that work for you?
So essentially, I studied to be a journalist. I came out of my journalism degree with this sort of epiphany that I needed to be on the other side of the microphone, or I needed to be creating work. I loved media and narrative and telling stories. So then I kind of found my way to art through, what was happening on the streets. I was really involved in social activism, really passionate about environmental issues, working on a number of campaigns in that realm. At the same time that I started seeing stuff pop up on the streets and realizing that my skills are creative. And so, yeah, it was just super fun scene to get involved in. And that was in Melbourne. Just, yeah. running around at night armed with like spray paint, changing billboards, throwing up stencils, getting together with other artists, breaking into buildings, putting on illegal exhibitions, like, you know, buildings that were going to be demolished. Yeah, it was
Mm,
very DIY and super fun. And yeah,
that
one
sounds
thing led
great.
to another, and I ended up with an art career. Yeah.
Mm. I used to see this. It's like a really weird magazine, but I'm sure you know the group like Adbusters. They would do all sorts of like
Hmm.
funny kind of like manipulation of advertisements in public, and what do they call it? Culture jamming. I thought
Yes.
that was like
Yeah.
a really interesting concept, and I think there's some analogy to the psychedelic experience there, a bit.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. Yeah. I love that. Yeah. Yeah. I know that work.
yeah, Robert Anton Wilson had this term called guerrilla ontology, and I think it kind of
Mm.
like mixes in here a little bit too, because art kind of is a it's a sort of guerrilla activism if done a certain way, because
Yeah.
you know, and
Definitely.
you're able to insert ideas, right? I
Hmm.
was just at the
Exactly.
Denver's holding an exhibition right now. I forget the dude's name, but he's the New York artist who created Where the Wild Things Are. It was a gigantic exhibition of
Oh
his work.
yeah. Ooh, nice.
A SIDEC maybe or something, and he was talking about social change through children's books. So
Yeah.
he's actually influencing culture at the child level as opposed to like I can only be at adult galleries, right? It's a fascinating.
Exactly. Exactly. That's what I really like
Mm,
really drew me to that particular art movement, was that it was taking art out of the gallery, out of this like more inaccessible area, and putting it like in surprising locations where people would, yeah, you could change their minds by what they were looking at on the street. And I was like, okay, I want to talk about how we understand ourselves, how we like take up space. Um, yeah. And I was like, I can just access an audience instantly.
hmm. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's fascinating. So, what was it about like this creative expression that did it for you? Was there something in particular? Or was it just like, oh, I'm finally feeling like my soul is cut a little bit loose, or what? Was there something? Go
Do you
ahead.
mean like about my creativity in general? Or do you mean
Yeah,
with,
and
yeah.
finding an outlet that worked for you, and you know what did that feel like, and why are you still doing it?
Hmm. It, yeah, it definitely, you know, and I've really been thinking a lot on this, and I appreciate the opportunity to talk about it. But yeah, the way that, yeah, creating art, I feel like it helps you connect to like your inner self, your higher self. If you're really coming from an instinctual place, and when you find that thing that you like, that soul expression, it connects with another soul, and
Mm,
that
that's beautiful.
experience, you know, feels amazing and transformative. And it's like I would always like feel like my art is like, you know, there's like this feedback loop that's happening where I'm making stuff, and I'm if I feel like if I'm really tapped into my what my soul's calling me to do in my creative work, and it really does has always felt like a calling to do it. um I'm not overthinking it, like I'm not using that default mode network area of my brain, or you know, I'm like, it's in the back, it's in the unconscious, and then to like bring it up and like sort of give it to the world to then provide their reflection often then would teach me something about myself.
Mm,
Yeah.
that's fascinating.
So
I
it's satisfying.
recently got to um hopefully I'm not too jittery here. I was able to go to a recent psychedelic conference in Philadelphia, and I started hearing about people talking about art in new ways that I had never heard before. And there's this one practice of like, as an art professor talking to one of the students, like, what does this object mean here in your painting? I'm like, I don't know. And then like try a different medium and zoom in on that object a few times to like explore that object. I was like, well, that's it's like a fascinating way to even approach psychedelic experience itself. And I think there's a lot around art that is you know, psyche manifesting, soul
Hmm.
manifesting, and it's
Absolutely.
yeah. Yeah. Have you had any kind of experience like that, like beyond just soul connecting, but like I think you spoke to it a little bit earlier, but maybe you could expand on it a bit.
About which part?
The art being kind of like psyche manifesting.
Yeah. think like a lot of it always feels like a compulsion to create something. Like there's something that's in the back of my mind that's brewing that's in response to everything else that's kind of going on. And then I've always really loved the concept of like the personal in the universal. So like looking for those common themes or narratives in experience and then yeah, creating from that space.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
So, can you tell us about how psychedelics kind of came on the radar for you?
So they came on the radar because when I was at university in Australia, and it was just before he passed, Terence McKenna came to my university and gave a talk when I was like 17, I think. Yeah. So essentially, I honestly don't really remember much. Like my father had passed away pretty recently, and I was like pretty in a pretty big grief moment of my life. Um, but I remember hearing him speak, and me and my boyfriend at the time were just like, yes, this is our path now. And we just together went down a big psychedelic journey for a few years. And yeah, and it really wasn't something I was even super like it takes kind of being older now and looking back to realize the impact of how those experiences made me realize like that yeah like what I was here to do was be creative, you know. Yeah.
Mm,
Yeah.
that's huge. um,
Yeah, definitely.
what was it like
Yeah,
seeing Terrence?
super cool. I just remember being like yeah, like I just remember like literally walking out and just being like, that's it. We're going to do acid like every weekend for the foreseeable future because we want that. We want to know what that is. Like, we're in,
Mm,
all in. Yeah, it was inspiring. Yeah,
it's amazing. Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. And are you still in touch with any of the psychedelic scene in Australia, in Melbourne?
Not so much. Like, I mean,
Hmm.
and I wasn't really super connected to it in Melbourne. A lot of my
Hmm.
early experiences were just really underground. I was actually living up near Byron Bay at that time. So it
Hmm.
was a lot of like going out and picking mushrooms and being really instinctual about it. Um, but now, and especially since being in the Vital program, I'm much more connected to people back home, which is really nice. It's actually been like a yeah full circle.
Have you connected with Diego then?
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
Yeah. He's
yeah. He's
brilliant.
great. It's wonderful.
Um, and for folks that don't know, Byron Bay, it's an interesting community. Is it kind of like a Boulder, Colorado kind of thing, or like a Malibu thing, or
I would say it's sort of kind of like a Woodstock thing, maybe.
cool?
Yeah,
I like that.
yeah, but like subtropical, more sprawling. Um,
Hmm.
yeah, I mean, it's definitely changed a lot over time. It's got some Malibu aesthetic, definitely in some areas. Yeah, but that whole
That's
hinterland is
outstanding.
just gorgeous. Yeah.
Yeah. I've never been to Australia. I'm talking with some folks next week, and hopefully we can get down there to do some events and get people together.
Nice.
And I think that would be really
Excellent.
fun.
Yeah, yeah, for
Yeah.
sure, for sure.
Yeah, that EGA group down there, Entheogenesis Australis or something, is like really, um, they've done so much good work in Australia.
Mhm.
I hope
Mhm.
to be able to connect with a bunch of them and get
Yeah.
them some platform because they've done
You're
so much good stuff.
awesome. Yeah, there's a lot of people doing good work out there.
Yeah. Okay, so now kind of you had that pretty intense psychedelic period. I assume you had some major insights for a while.
Mhm. Mhm.
And like, were there any kind of like major lessons in the early days of psychedelics for you? And
Um,
maybe ones that relate to art specifically?
I find myself still like now bringing elements of certain experiences into my work in a subconscious way and in a conscious
Hmm.
way. And even being able to go back in my memory and recall how things looked, like moss getting like my work is very colorful because also when I'm on psychedelics, I experience a lot of color, a lot. Like it doesn't take a lot for me to see like a rainbow coming off every white light or, you know, mushrooms, trees, like anything natural glowing and pulsing with like its essence. So I'll go back and draw on those experiences when I'm creating something.
Mm, brilliant.
Yeah.
And I assume in the last bunch of years there might have been like a resurgence of interest for you around psychedelics.
Yeah, definitely. I think it's always been a part of my life, on and off. You know, I've had like, yeah,
Hmm.
those early experiences in my 20s where I would like, yeah, do a lot of different experimentation and, you know, yeah, like drawing and literally creating art after having journeys. And then, yeah, dipping in and out. I mean, for a long time, it's been like a birthday tradition of mine to like get a group of friends together, do like a little medi dose, go out in nature, spend the day swimming, hiking, creating, playing. Yeah.
Mm, I love
But it's
that.
definitely, yeah, it's definitely been wonderful to kind of, you know, see the psychedelic renaissance like come back up and feel like
Hmm.
it's a time where I can like talk about its impact on my work because for me this is like really new. Like even describing my work as psychedelic informed, because people sometimes will look at my work and they see that in what I'm doing, and you know, and then I'm like, I'm not a visionary artist. Like I'm psychedelic informed.
Hmm.
Like what I create comes from the way I think about the world, connection. Yes, visually how it looks. But I'm not like going on a journey or having an experience and trying to like recreate that from some for somebody visually, right? Which is what I see visionary art as. Is like really recreating it in a
Hmm.
way. Um, for me, it's like maybe sharing like the experience and expressing that through the painting that I've made or yeah, like putting something ineffable into some sort of like way I can communicate it that's not language.
Mm. And so in the New York art scene, like where so there was kind of a vacuum of conversations around psychedelics for a while, and I assume like it kind of got introduced maybe like after 2017, maybe, or I guess how long have you been in New York again?
I've been here for like 12 years, I think. And I lived down
Okay,
in Mexico for a while. I lived in Tulum in
great,
the sort of, yeah, during that period and then came back up here. Um,
cool.
yeah, yeah.
Um,
But yeah, I've
and go ahead.
Oh yeah, no, I was just gonna say, but yeah, I didn't really ever move in like the visionary art scene. For me, it's always been like, yeah, much more like the
Hmm.
street and graffiti art scene. Yeah,
Cool. Um, yeah. So uh, this there was a pretty robust, I guess, drug and psychedelic informed art scene for a little while with like the Andy Warhol stuff, the
hmm,
Warehouse, and the Greenwich Village scene, and there was this like subcurrent or undercurrent, and there's a huge amount of artists that go to Burning Man in New York, so it's like there was this kind of like interchange of that kind of energy, I'm sure, but
yeah,
often it had to be not so explicit, and then.
hmm,
Um, yeah, and I kind of saw that in Boston when I was hanging out with a bunch of artists there, and it was interesting. I was like, this is a big influence on you, but you're not allowed to talk about it in some way. And I felt like a lot of my work was trying to like make people have more explicit conversations instead of beating around the bush. Um,
yeah, definitely.
yeah,
Yeah, I think
yeah,
it's a really important conversation to have. I think that artists in general are people who always are pushing boundaries, you know, or and wanting to expand their consciousness and kind of go to their edge and see what they find there and bring it back so that everybody else can like look at it or you know see things from a new perspective. And in order to like see things from a new perspective, like you know, we know when we open up our neuroplasticity, we can kind of like stand in a different corner of our brain and see things in a different way. and there's a lot of
Hmm.
insight that can be gained and inspiration.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's interesting. And like, what kind of would you get certain attitudes from fellow artists sometimes when they didn't want to talk about it, or were just like, maybe in their work and or in yours?
Um, no, I mean, like, I
Hmm.
think the attitude of what it's always been like when somebody can kind of see it in your work and you can see it in their work, it's like a secret wink or something. And
Hmm.
maybe yeah, it depends on, one people's comfort levels, but yeah,
That's fun.
yeah,
Cool.
yeah.
Um, and then like, what was it like seeing it become more explicit and you being able to be more explicit?
In the general conversation,
Right, around
um,
psychedelics and yeah, in general. But like,
yeah.
in the art context, I guess.
I mean, for me, it's like it's still unfolding, you know.
Hmm. Yeah.
It's like a part of, it's not something I've talked about a lot publicly. So I think there is a lot more renewed interest, and
Hmm.
yeah, and I love having conversations about it. So yeah, it's all been good, really.
Yeah. Neat. Um,
Yeah.
so, and what about like buyers, consumers, and galleries? Is it becoming kind of like more common vocabulary there as well?
Um, yeah, I think so. I think so.
Cool.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. People are
Um,
definitely more open.
yeah, yeah, and I think in like the art collector, art appreciator world, like there's, I think, a growing vocabulary.
Hmm.
I assume you made it to Cosm while they were still in Chelsea.
I didn't. I
Um,
never made it to.
oh,
No, I think when I arrived, it was in the tail end, or I have been upstate though.
yeah, that
Yeah,
was gorgeous in Chelsea. It's I think a
yeah,
lot prettier in upstate.
it's beautiful up
Was
there.
it Warpinger Falls? Yeah, I think
Yes.
they're, they kind of like held the lantern. They like, kept it alive and very explicit, which is
Yeah.
lovely.
Mhm.
And,
Mhm.
that was kind of a thing that they were incubating for a really long time. And just, I think they left it a really interesting time for like the rest of the city to kind of take over and like,
Yeah.
become a little more, yeah. Um,
Yeah. Yeah. They make really, really amazing work. It's very cool.
mhm.
Hmm.
Now, in terms of like impact of art, like, are you hopeful in any way, or can you speak to like, the influence you hope psychedelic informed art could have on people?
Um, well, I think in general, like all art, you want to have an impact, right? Like it's kind of
Hmm.
that's the point. It's like whatever you are sharing or talking about. I like the idea that I've always like wanted to make work that is really accessible in a way that like a child could get something out of it, or you
Hmm.
know like they're going to enjoy it, but there's multiple levels to the work
Yeah.
and to understanding what's going on. And um yeah, I think that for me it's always been about like kind of like bringing back a story and telling it. So it's like
Hmm.
it's not lost on me that I'm in, the center of Manhattan in this building overlooking the whole city, and it's like all concrete, and I'm here creating this work that's like really talking about how we're connected to the natural world in this like, we are one essentially, which is a very psychedelic lens to be seeing the world through. And so I'm always hopeful that it's like I'm reminding people of that truth
Hmm.
that I think, when we expand our consciousnesses, that we remember to be true,
Hmm.
but we forget all the time. So it's like I hope my art is serves as a reminder of that, and also maybe speaks to if people have had experiences with plant medicine or molecules, they recognize it. If they haven't, they're like they still can share in that knowledge and experience.
Hmm.
Yeah.
I was chatting with Vince, who um, was one of the co-founders at Meow Wolf, and he
Hmm.
talked about how the dream was just making um, democratizing the psychedelic experience without having to use molecules and like through art. And
Yeah.
I found that really interesting because they're, I'm pretty big in the breathwork world, and the idea that you can achieve states without drugs is like one of the fundamental ideas that we deal with. Um,
Yeah. Yeah,
mm,
definitely. And that's why I love it, like saying psychedelic lens. Because it's like,
hmm
and I feel like, I brought that into like my coaching as well, like, and my creativity. It's like, this is how I'm seeing things from a different perspective. So we can like, yeah, there can be some new insight in that moment,
mm.
whether it's like in the art that I'm making or the conversations that I'm having.
So before we jump over to coaching, I'm kind of curious, like
Hmm.
how does your um it feels like an obnoxious question, but I'm like, okay, what is like
Try
what
me.
does like creation look like going from like concept to creation and then going into like galleries and shows? Like, is it like a really
Mm-hmm.
typical flow for you, or is there something unique you do?
Like, I love to work with dreams. Sometimes, like, I'll have a dream and
Hmm
there's like this little moment in it, and I'll use that um, as the starting point,
hmm
I had like a really profound um, psychedelic experience recently where I turned into a bird. And
hmm
I've been working with birds and transformation and flight for so long. It was like,
hmm
you know, I looked back at my old work and was like, wow, I was already tapping into something in that experience back then that I hadn't even had yet. Um, so it really comes a lot from my subconscious. And then I'll just sort of get an image in my mind and I'm like, okay, how am I going to make it? I'll sometimes bring in photography um, so that I can like recreate that. And then again, I'll
hmm
kind of like see it again through another lens, the watercolor, paint it, spend that time making the work, um, and then putting it out into the world. And whether that's been in exhibitions or a commission piece or I'm doing a print. Um, yeah. Sometimes it's like I feel like the work just like it comes through you. I remember hearing an artist many, many years ago talking about creativity like blowing like a wind. And I know Rick
hmm
Rubin's spoken into this with his book and on his podcast. Like it's coming through you, and if you don't kind of like grab it and do something with it, it'll kind of blow through to the next person, and then that's fine. And then we see these like this thing pop up in the zeitgeist that we were like, I really believe that's how it works. So sometimes it's kind of like it's cathartic in lots of ways. It's like something I'm compelled to do and make, and sometimes something will sit aside for a really long time before I feel like it finds the person it's meant to be for. That
mm.
doesn't happen often, but sometimes I'll have a piece and I'm like, just make it because I feel like I need to. And then someone eventually will come to my studio and see it and be like, I need that. I'm like, oh, okay, it was for you. Cool.
hmm I love
Yeah.
that.
Yeah.
uh, and did you ever play with NFT stuff for your art?
I've done some digital stuff. I never really got that into it though at the time when
Hmm
it was all exploding.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Cool. I think it's an interesting thing, and it's an interesting model for artists to make some different kinds of revenue, because it's like
Hmm.
being an artist isn't easy.
Oh,
Um,
100%. I'm like, I think the blockchain is brilliant.
mm,
It's just about, I think, bringing more creativity to it, which I think is starting to happen.
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
There was like a conference a while ago called Crypto Psychedelic, and they're kind of, I think the primary focus of that event was trying to get psychedelic people to, or sorry, crypto people to donate to psychedelic
Hmm.
organizations, which is fine. I just think we can go a lot further than that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Um, yeah.
Definitely.
Like the idea of a simple piece of software kind of like cutting back on bureaucracy that's not necessary or helpful. It's like pretty
Yeah,
big, right?
exactly. And also just like tracking and proving providence and,
Hmm
knowing where things are that
Yeah.
you've made. Yeah.
Yeah. That's interesting. I never thought about that. Um, and they were doing like fractionalized ownership of like really
Yeah.
expensive paintings, and I
Mm-hmm.
thought
I
that
love,
was,
and I think that's awesome. Decentralizing. Yeah. It's very cool.
yeah. I wonder how it'll shake out and look, and with those older projects in a couple years, and also like what kind of novel projects are going to be coming, 'cause it's
Mm.
nonstop.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. So coaching.
Mm-hmm.
So you do what you're calling transformative coaching, and
Yeah.
what does that look like for you? What is transformative coaching?
Yeah. So I like it was kind of after the pandemic. I've been making art for a long time. Not wanting to have a complete career change, but also really wanting to like expand what I did in the world.
Hmm.
Um, and really wanting to like start to talk more publicly about the influence of psychedelics on my work. Also, yeah, being more creative and playful with those experiences. And yeah, so I was like, I want to do something a little bit different, like, and really thinking about how in my life I've connected to like my calling and really living that out. And I just think also the times that we live in, it's really important for people. It's important for people's happiness and the broader world at large. I think for everybody to be more connected to that soul calling, their higher self, their inner teacher. So really feeling called towards that, and also just wanting to be a nerd and study. So yeah, did my coaching certification at Sophia University, which is where Diego went and did
Hmm.
their like transpersonal institute. And I was like, I really wanted to learn more about transpersonal psychology. Yeah, and ended up doing the Vital program, which Ido Cohen introduced me to that.
Oh, cool.
And yeah, yeah. So I was like, okay, I know I want to like bring coaching in and my creativity and like my art, and how do I bring all of these things into what I'm doing in my life. And um yeah, realizing that like I wanted to coach people in using transpersonal methods, and also to focus on like psychedelic integration coaching. um yeah, so I learned so much with my time at Vital. Thank you for that. And yeah, so yeah, now I'm like interweaving these things together. So I do, yeah, like one-on-one coaching, a microdose program with some people. Yeah.
That's great. So for folks who don't know,
Yeah.
Diego has been a longtime team member here at Psychedelics Today. He's one of the leads over at the Vital program. And then Ido Cohen's a friend, colleague, and a big part of the Vital program as well. A Jungian psychologist living in San Francisco. How do you know him?
So we met through like a mutual friend and like another
Hmm.
sort of podcast community that I was a part of.
Mm.
And we ended up having conversations, talking about integration, talking about creativity. Um, yeah, I think like I reached out to him and was like, I think I want to do some more study, sort of like cross all my T's and dot all my I's before I'm like moving more into the psychedelic space. And he was like, you've got to do Vital. I was like, okay, cool. Yeah. I was like,
I love that
trust.
he's that good with Vital. Yeah, he he's been just a rock for us and
Mm.
so helpful, so kind.
Yeah, he's a phenomenal teacher. Like, yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
I've learned so much through him. So yeah,
awesome.
yeah,
I think we've got a project coming with him, or he's got a project that we're going to partner with him on around depth psychology and psychedelics, like a real deep Jungian
amazing.
focus specifically. So that
Ooh,
could
I
be
look
really
forward to that.
right.
Yeah,
Um, More details soon, I hope.
yeah,
Um,
yeah. And like I learned so much, I think, in the last year as well, just like through people like Ido, in ways that in like my psychedelic studies have informed my coaching, like bringing in archetypes, bringing in like, yeah, those Jungian um, mythopoetic metaphors and ways of seeing the world that just, yeah, mesh perfectly with, yeah, coaching people through transformation as well as, yeah, psychedelics.
Yeah, that's fun. So
Yeah.
kind of like what turn this into an infomercial for a second. So like how
No.
like what was it about Vital that like felt like it was for you when you started seeing it and looking at it?
Ah, so yeah, I don't know. Like I do things pretty instinctually.
Mm,
Like, and um when a couple of different synchronicities occur, I always pay attention. I think anybody who's like, played in the psychedelic world, like their ears prick up when, it's like when three people mention the same thing to you and all in a week. So when I started like looking into different courses, it was like Edo was like, oh, popped up. And then David Drabkin actually was in a WhatsApp group that I was in. And then he mentioned it. And then I loved the way that everything was like centered around the elements. Like that really spoke to me. And
mm,
just the thoroughness. I was like, I'm 20 years of experience, but like there's like academic stuff I want to learn. And
hmm.
yeah. So like yeah, my nerdiness was just like, yes.
That's great. And like I love that the elements thing worked for you. That was like a we've
I
had
loved
to
it.
fight to keep including it because um some people get uncomfortable talking about like the classical elements, but I love Greek philosophy. I love the old
Yeah.
world, and I think like we're so divorced from that way of thinking that we're losing a big part of our kind of cultural inheritance in a
A
way.
100%, 100%. And I think when you're talking about psychedelics, that's so important. These are like plants and fungi, and they have like a rich history and a lot of, that, yeah, like the elements is connected to nature, right? And it also is like part of our like educational history as a culture. So yeah, I think it's important to
Yeah.
remember those things. Yeah. Yeah. And just to see things in a different way. You're like, okay,
Mhm.
integration is like air
Mm.
now.
I think this is some like a method that a lot of people used in the past was you have some sort of skeleton, like cultural skeleton. You can just like, okay, here's where these things go on this like, blank Christmas tree for lack of a better word, right? Like, and that's how you can organize the universe in a way. And the elements were one of
Yeah.
those
Yeah.
systems. And
Yeah. Yeah, totally. It's all about like, I think, finding what works for you. Like
mhm,
within, yeah, like the coaching work that I do that I love, it's like, I'm always like, okay, so like what's your spiritual lens or your philosophical lens? Or like, yeah, we can play with these different ways of like seeing the world. Like what, does astrology speak to you as like as a narrative and a way to explain things? Like we're meaning making machines. That's what we are. We
mhm.
need to make meaning out of what's going on. So what kind of like tools have we got? you know like I like thinking about it like, okay, like I've got some like arrows in my quiver, which one am I going to pull out?
Yeah.
um what speaks to me? Like, and knowing that everybody has different things that are going to speak to them, and that's great, that's perfect.
Mm.
Yeah.
So was there um air and integration was what came to mind for you first. Were there
Yeah,
other kind of like analogies that were helpful for you?
I mean, I think with the elements,
Yeah.
ah, I mean, that was the one that just like really stuck to me. But I
Yeah.
think the first one was earth, right? So like grounding, creating the stable structure before you like move up and out.
Hmm.
Yeah. Yeah. And then like, yeah, I think that's, yeah, it just makes sense.
Did you get a chance to read Chris Bache's book, LSD and the Mind of the Universe? I think the subtitle is like
No.
Diamonds from Heaven. So
Oof.
he was a religious studies professor, a student of Stan Groff, Holgerbrecht breathwork guy. Um, and he, in his book, documents this like series of 70, maybe 70 plus high dose experiences that he
Mm,
went through, kind of like, the full jam, eye shades, laying down, support.
yeah.
And there's some really far out stuff in there, and you can consider like a religious philosophy professor, religious studies professor, like writing about these experiences is really really helpful. But then he's like, I really, if I had to do it all over again, I would have worked on my biographical life first before going so far out. And I
Hmm.
think that kind of speaks to what you were talking about. It's like, yeah, how do we ground first? How do we like have some kind of safe place to come back to when we go so far out, if we choose to go that far, even? Yeah,
Exactly. Exactly. Yeah, it's important.
yeah.
Yeah.
Um, sometimes I like to push the limits, and then sometimes I like to reel it way back in, and go like, okay, I'm gonna go moderate for a couple years, and
Yeah, definitely. I feel like I pushed the limits when I was younger, for sure. Um, and that's where you know where the limit is, right? Because you push
mm-hmm,
it and then you find it and then you're like, okay. But one of the things that I've loved to learn about is the idea of like our personal like different absorption levels. And I've always felt like, especially with psychedelics, it's kind of like once the door's been opened enough, it's like way easier to step through. And you don't necessarily need to be doing like a high dose of mushrooms or a high dose of anything to have a lot of profound, amazing experiences. Um, yeah,
I was hearing that from some of my friends who are serious acid lovers, and I was just like, I was kind of giggling. I'm like, yeah, right, totally. And I'm like, okay, I tried it. I was like, oh, you're right, you're right. Okay.
yeah, yeah,
Um, and I
yeah,
find that like really helpful and like a healthy thing. And people can get really amplified if they overuse. And
yeah,
I kind of see that in a lot of the communities, like ayahuasca communities included. Like you can just do it too often, and it makes your
totally.
life harder instead of better.
Exactly, exactly. That's why integration is so important. And that's why I love doing that work for people. Because I'm like,
Yeah.
okay, like if you're not taking what you learned and doing something with it, or a lesson, if your subconscious or the plants are trying to tell you something and you're not listening, it's going to kick you in the ass eventually. Like you just doing more is not going to suddenly make it integrate. You've got to like do all the work that's beyond that experience. Yeah, or even if it's just like for creative inspiration, if you're not taking that inspiration, and yeah, it's going to be destabilizing.
Hmm. Yeah. I I recently hit a speed bump, and I was like, oh boy, I need to I need to really slow down for
Yeah,
a while. And yeah, it took me like 2+ weeks to like get it back together, but I got it back together, and it was like, okay,
nice.
just
Welcome back.
I'm not, I'm not exceptional.
Yeah,
I'm just like most other humans when they interface with these things, like there's all sorts of, possible, treasures and perils. And
exactly,
yeah.
exactly. There's doors that open,
Hmm.
doors of perception, and sometimes they might not close for a while. Um, yeah,
Hmm.
yeah.
And how do you like to talk about psychedelics to your coaching clients? Like, I'm sure they're asking you questions about it.
Um, so if I'm doing like microdose coaching with somebody, I like to have a pretty um intensive like first session that's really about information and sharing and question and answers. Um, because I think that's necessary, obviously, and also like education so important. I've learned so much so that I can share it. Um, and with yeah, like if people have there's a particular experience that they want to work on or integrate, then that's sort of in its own container, which is there. Yeah. But yeah, I also kind of just explain to people that, if I'm like, they don't have to have had psychedelic experiences to coach with me. Like, I kind of will use the gifts that it's given me to like look at things in a different way, bring my own
Hmm.
creative vision to it, bring my metaphors and things. And then they kind of get those benefits in a way.
Mm.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's excellent. Um, So what kind, like, so say you're doing microdosing coaching, what does that kind of process look like for folks coming through one of your programs?
So at the moment I've been doing one-on-one, but I'm like putting together like a group program at the moment, which I'm really excited about because it's kind of going to have a bit more structure because I've really been sort of just testing it out with a friend as well, who I've been coaching and getting like realizing kind of like the layers that need to get peeled back as we go. Um, and working with the way that yeah, like microdosing psilocybin, like what it brings up in your subconscious. Um, yeah, and also like interweaving some dream work in, which I think
Mm,
is, especially if I'm like, if people are microdosing at night, I think like then you're basically kind of having this experience in your dreams that holds a lot of information and richness that you can also work with.
yeah.
Yeah.
Trying to find the book. I think it's like letting your body interpret your dreams by like
Mm,
Eugene Geldin or something like that. He's like a lot of that stuff I think can relate to psychedelic integration and meaning making also. I love that you're doing
definitely.
some dream stuff with people.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. Like I love using, yeah, integration methods with myself and my dreams. I've like,
mhm.
that's a real nexus point because my art has been influenced by my dreams for a really long time. And then, yeah, I see the similarities with like doing an integration of a psychedelic experience or a dream. The way that with like 5-MeO, you can have reactivations in your dreams. So it's like, okay, then let's take
Mhm.
that reactivation that happened in the dreamland and integrate that. Um, yeah. And then coaching is the same sort of thing. It's like people are uncovering things, they're learning things, and then they'll need to like take it forward.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right, so personal question
Yep.
from me about dreams.
Sure.
So I'm
Yes.
working to get my cannabis dose to be really low per day because I've noticed, and I think
Yeah.
plenty of other people notice this, is that it gets kind of in the way of dreams. Um,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
and so I'm probably going to scoop up some product from like, some of these vendors. Like I think Ancestral Magi has some really interesting stuff, and there's a few
Oh
other
yeah, I've
people
heard of
doing
them.
like dream supplements and
Yeah.
like how do you try to get people to dream, or do you help people like figure out dreaming?
So, okay, here's my like little tips or whatever. I really like to use like herbs
Hmm.
or flowers like blue lotus, damiana, mugwort, things like this that will amplify your, I don't know how it works, but it will amplify your dreams. As well, like just journaling. That's the main like in key is like as soon as you wake up, starting to write down what you remember, and you kind of go back in time because you'll realize that as you start writing, one thing will lead to the next, and then sometimes you can differentiate where one dream stops, another one starts. When I'm really good at doing my dream journaling, which isn't always like I can usually remember like 4 dreams, which is usually on average. And the other thing you could do is use like a sleep cycle monitor, or like if you have an Aura ring, and that will tell you when you're in REM sleep, so you'll know as well. Like, oh, okay, I probably had 2 dreams, which can help you kind of like unweave the stories.
Hmm.
Yeah,
That's neat. I like that.
yeah.
All right, I'll have a not like
Those are
I
my
didn't know some of
tips.
this stuff, but I'm gonna put my notebook
Yeah,
on
they're
my
pretty
bedstand
basic.
tonight.
Definitely. Just the more you do it, the
Hmm.
more it works. And then,
Hmm.
yeah, really like unpacking things of like, okay, how did I feel? What does that
Hmm.
mean to me? Like, am I going to take this dream and think about every character being a facet of myself? Or
Hmm.
is it trying to show me something about my relationship to something else? Which is, of course, all part of what's inside you and your psyche. But, there's
Right.
different ways to kind of like stand in the dream. Yeah.
Right. Do you like to think about dreams similarly to how you think about psychedelic experience?
I do. And that's probably because when I was a child, I had like night terrors. I did have like a lot
Mm.
of sleep things. And for people who don't know what a night terror is like, it's kind of like you're on acid, except for you're 4 years old, like because your eyes are open and your dream world and the world that you can see blend together, you know?
I've only seen it
And
once, and it's terrifying. Like a little
yeah,
girl. I'm like, I don't know
yeah,
how to help you.
yeah, it would happen to me, you know, like I had that. I had like, you know, a couple of times where I had like sleep paralysis. My dreams have always
Hmm.
been like super, super vivid. Um, when I was a kid, I used to think about like, is that the real world or is this it? Or like, you know, really think about those things a lot.
Hmm.
So yeah, good friends of mine know this, that I am inclined to send them dream stories and they like it, which is like thankful because like sometimes, especially if they're in it, I'm like, oh, this thing happened.
Hmm.
Um, yeah, I love sharing those stories. I think it's like it's a really beautiful way to unpack what's going on in your life. You know, it's like extra information.
I wonder sometimes about like the deliriant effect from things like Ambien, where
Mm,
people are having conversations, they're driving and eating from the fridge, and they don't know.
it's
I think
crazy.
that's why they don't they don't really like prescribe Ambien as much as they used to.
Yeah.
I only had the pleasure of getting a prescription once because I was like flying to Asia for like 4 weeks or something for work, and I'm like, okay, I time zones are gonna really hose me, but like, it was a
Yeah.
gamble. I'm like, I heard really bad things can happen on airplanes, but let's just try it and see if I wake up in zip ties. And I didn't. I did fine. But other people like
Wow.
that material can just come out, right? It's like your subconscious is exposed and accessible even if you're not like consciously aware of it. And
Yeah. Mm.
right.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Totally. Yeah. That's wild. Like Ambien is just something I've only ever heard of. I don't think we had it in Australia. Um,
It's
yeah,
probably not safe.
it doesn't sound like it.
I was chatting with my doctor the other day because like I'm gonna have a lot of travel coming up. It's like some stress. Like, can I have some? She's like, no, sorry. I'm like, fine, fine. Um,
Yeah.
and yeah, it's been that day. Like I remember in like 2003, some of my friends were on it, and they were doing the full thing. Um,
Yeah.
and I was studying psychedelics heavily at the time, so I'm like, okay, interesting. I wonder like what is coming up from the psyche there when.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Because it sounds like it is psychoactive in some way. Um,
I could be wrong, but bear with me, everybody, and send me a message if I'm wrong. But this really great book that I love called "Drugged" by Richard Miller, and it does
oh
kind
yeah,
of
I've
like a
heard of that.
history. It's so good. It does a history of like the development of drugs in today's era, right? Like coming out of kind of like industrialized Germany and Prussia and like these companies that were making all sorts of industrial products. And they're like, what do we do with these things? It looks like some of them have really interesting effects. But I think Ambien comes from the Amanita muscaria mushroom, like muscimol. It's like a
Huh.
variant on that. So like there's, I believe this is accurate, but I've read the book 3 times, so I hope I'm right. But like um, I think there's some similarity there, and I find
Mm.
that fascinating.
Well, that would make
Yeah.
sense. Yeah.
Yeah.
A little
Cool.
byproduct.
So back to coaching.
Mm-hmm,
Who do you
mm-hmm.
like to work with?
I like to work with creative people in like the broadest sense of the word. You know, people who I think like entrepreneurs are really creative. I've worked with like filmmakers, writers, um, psychedelic facilitators. But yeah, just in the broadest sense of the word, creative people who are creative thinkers, but maybe want to even be more creative. Um, yeah, yeah, people
Mm,
who are interested in expanding their consciousness.
cool.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, I like problem solving. I like when entrepreneurs are like, okay, we have to really change the world, and this seems to be the avenue with which we can do it. And no shade on nonprofit and charity work, but sometimes like we have to use business to make real change. And I'm glad you're doing
Absolutely.
that.
Yeah, it's like yeah, a friend of mine would say, and you know, I think many people have said this, like capitalism is difficult, like, but it's the water we're swimming in, you know. So how do we
Hmm.
navigate it to, yeah, how do we navigate those waters? because we don't have a
Mm.
choice. Like we're in it. And yeah, so being like, ideally for me, like with the work that I do with coaching is just like, having clients and like being a part, like I get so invested in their success, like, but having, people who are wanting to do, yeah, good things in the world, or really like tap into, what the way that their soul wants them to show up, and then, helping them be on that journey is like, that's where the magic is for me. Yeah.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. Um,
Yeah. It feels good.
that's great. So, how does it feel having, on one hand, like an art practice and work in art, and on the other hand, like an outlet and work in coaching? Does it feel more balanced for you?
Um, yeah. Yeah, it's really interesting because I feel like often I use this analogy of like spinning plates, because even within my creative world, like, I'm doing stuff in the studio. I have like, a residency that I'm going to do later in the year, working on a commission for a museum. And these are all like different things. And so now it's like I'm bringing in this, like, some, I don't know, my plates are getting differently spun. And I love like the balance and the way that like coaching and that work, it frees me up in some ways with what I'm doing creatively. Yeah. So I'm really interested to kind of like see how I keep bringing these things together and apart, you know?
Yeah.
Yeah. Like I have something I've been working on for a really long time, which is like a kind of like a workshop basically to help people like use creativity to integrate their psychedelic experiences, because I think, like, often on retreats or whatever, people are like, here's like, we're going to integrate with art, but people don't necessarily aren't taught skills about how to activate their own creative voice, right?
Hmm.
So yeah, that I've done it a few times, and yeah, I want to host it again, but it's really, I think, fun, and like it's also like, yeah, necessary to have these tools shared. um Yeah. So that's like one of the ones where I'm like, oh, these are these things coming together where I can like, yeah, bring all of my interests and my skills into like one thing that I'm doing. Yeah.
All right. I got a big philosophical question for you.
Oh, bring it on.
All right. So, in our kind of like current technological climate, where a lot of our attention is like held hostage by corporations, and they're, kind of monetizing our, awareness, like
Mm-hmm.
how can like art, and maybe specifically like non-digital art, be a tool to help us kind of cure some of the things that are kind of impacting us so heavily right now, and maybe even build community?
Um, in so many ways, like I think, you know, um, like getting together and making art. Like I do a little event series at my studio occasionally called the Art of Wellness, and there's always like an art integration part of it. Um, and there's like, I think, neuroscience or scientific studies that talk about like when we get together in community and just create, and it's just like by moving our hands and being playful, like how it's better for our happiness, our dopamine, our serotonin, our feeling connection in community. And that's pretty easily accessible. You could just get together a bunch of friends and be creative and be playful together. Like it doesn't
Hmm.
have to be going to an event to do that. um and I think that people want that. And I think definitely like right now where we're seeing people being more aware of, we all walk around with these like devices in our hands, and they're like sucking our attention, and you know the social media spaces that people thought were more um, of a level playing field, which maybe they began that way, are not. And they're not giving people what they desire. You know, the opposite thing happens where people want to be in real life, face to face, creating. Yeah. And then it can cycle back around, obviously, and people share things online. But yeah, that's kind of how I see it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think like we're up against a really interesting thing. And I think it's like exponential change that we don't understand how to even model. And I
Yeah.
think a thing that's coming is like more technology, and like what are humans going to want? And it's more connection, more time doing analog things, I hope. And
Yeah.
then mhm,
Yeah. I mean, we talk like that's a kind of, I feel like a general conversation that seems to be
mhm,
out there. Like, oh, we're all connected, but everybody's lonely, you know?
yeah.
Um, yeah. And I think it's just being intentional and people being more interested in being intentional. And when you realize like that this, you know, like I guess it's like somebody snuck a packet of cigarettes into your bedroom that you're accidentally smoking, right? And then you have to then be assertive and make changes. And I think right now, what we're seeing, especially in the climate here, it seems to me anyway, people wanting to be more in alignment with their authenticity and their ethics. And um, yeah, I'm interested to see those shifts happen, right?
Yeah, I was listening to a podcast the other day, and the guy was suggesting a uh, one angle, one idea for one geography is mini golf membership club. You can just be like goofy and be with people, and like country club
Yes.
version of mini golf. I'm like, that's fucking
Yeah.
funny.
Yeah.
Um, and I'm like, all right,
I
interesting.
love that.
Um, so
And
all
it's why
right,
like the Burning Man community is so awesome. Like I love that Burning Man community because it's a community that does things in real life, and like it's like experiential. It's about direct experience. It's about like making art and being in it and the collective, the community. Yeah.
yeah. Can you give an example of like what those communities might do that's like really interesting in New York, for instance, like off Playa?
Um, just like DIY self-run parties, talks, the way that community has then like, brought people together to go on retreats, like the macro guy down to the micro.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I love that. And
Yeah.
yeah, like let's keep Ticketmaster out of the equation. Like, how do we make sure it's like our thing? Yeah,
Yeah.
it's cool, and I love
Yeah.
it. I love that community, and like how weird it is, and like how yeah, just
Yeah.
there's not much I dislike. This year, I'll go this year, and I'm expecting a lot of chaos. And I'm really excited about it.
Yeah. The chaos is the best part. It's like, a living, breathing kind of entity.
Hmm. Absolutely. Um,
Yeah.
cool. So final couple questions here. So,
Mm-hmm. Sure.
um, bringing it back to Vital. So, like,
Okay.
what kind of people do you think are best suited for something like Vital?
Hmm. Um, I think that, yeah, people who like want to learn, like, I mean, it's cliche that you've got to like have an open mind, which I think is obviously most people. I think that it's really cool to see how many people who are kind of like newer to psychedelics and the psychedelic scene, that are, in more traditional healing roles in there. I think like the diversity of people is one of like the strengths of the program
Mm,
that I really feel. It's like, you're kind of like rubbing shoulders with like therapists and doctors and somebody else who's like creative or a podcaster or yeah. And yeah, so it's like being enmeshed in that community, people who want to be in a community and give as well as receive.
mm. And what was it like being next to people actually doing medicine, right? Like, meaning doctors and therapists. And we're like, I'm an artist. Like, I have similar like weird imposter syndrome, where like I'm a computer guy that studied, philosophy, but like, what am I doing here? But like, what was that like to be with people with like
Yeah.
seriously deep training?
I mean, it just like makes you realize that everybody has something else to offer, you know?
Hmm.
And it's like, whilst, yeah, maybe they've got that like niche medical training, maybe they don't have the same creative way of speaking about psychedelics that I do. And it's like, we can like cross pollinate and share um, perspectives and knowledge.
Mm.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's
And it makes you
beautiful.
realize, like, you both, I think you both end up appreciating what you have or what your skills are, when you may
Hmm.
have like that imposter syndrome, of like, oh, these people are like, as a doctor or whatever. But then it's like, yeah, you realize that we all have these different things to give, you know?
Hmm. Yeah, Tim
Yeah.
Leary had these like great ways of talking about games people play. So I'm playing the doctor game. So I put on the doctor's story and reality tunnel, and I'm doing doctor things, and like it's cool
Yeah.
and really helpful in society. But like when we like rewind the tape a little bit for ourselves, we're like, wait, I'm a human, and this is a game I'm playing. This isn't necessarily like this game isn't necessarily life or being human. It's just like the cultural script, and then we can kind of like peel that
Yeah.
back and be a little more human.
A
Um,
100%, a hundred
yeah.
percent. Like, that was like a really big thing with me and my art, and like
Hmm.
being so known as Vexta, and this is like the thing I've done. This is like who I am. And, when I started getting more serious with meditation, I remember sort of having that one of those aha moments where I was like, oh, but like, yeah, then there's these other layers and these other parts. Um,
Mm.
yeah, yeah, so I've definitely thought about that quite a bit, because even with my coaching and my psychedelic work, I was like, is this a part of who I am as Vexter, or is this like something completely different, or how do these things come together? um yeah. And even in the coaching work I do, it's like there's a lot of stuff comes up around identity. And I think the troubles occur, or the difficulty, is when we get too identified with one part of ourselves,
Mm.
whereas we're really all of these different things in one, yeah, human experience. But especially within like the capitalist structure, right? It's like, it's like, what do you do? Like, your job defines you. Whereas it
Hmm.
doesn't really. Yeah.
Right. It's kind of like a shallow description of what you are. Just like, what is your
Yeah.
function?
Yeah, totally. Yeah, it's like, that's important, but, and
Hmm. Yeah, it's like
yeah.
it's funny to like be analyzing it. We're like yeah, at the same time as we're kind of like functionaries. Often we're also like far more than that, and we lose the script sometimes. I think this is kind of what he was talking about, like the turn on, tune in, drop out deal. It's more about
Yeah.
like you know drop out a little bit of consensus reality, so we can like understand ourselves and our nervous system a little bit better, and come back more holistically
Yeah.
informed, I think.
Yeah.
um,
Totally. Totally. It's
mm.
important. It's important.
So anything else you want to add, or how can people find you?
Um, is there anything else I want to add? Hmm. Yeah, I just really, yeah, I was just pondering then, like, what you were saying about just the importance of community, and, stepping outside of like the onslaught of information that we're getting all the time right now, especially with the way things are, and how just important it is to have those moments to step out, but then also be in community with each other. Um, yeah, it's where the healing is.
Yeah,
Yeah. Yeah.
totally. I want to create more opportunity for people to just get together, and not necessarily at a psychedelic retreat. Like that's, there's plenty of
Hmm.
those, but like let's just
Yeah.
get psychedelic people together and see what happens. And
Yeah.
maybe I can do that
Definitely.
with Vital alumni soon. I think that'd be really
Yeah.
fun, and current
Well,
students for that matter.
I would love to have you at the studio. You know, Bible is always welcome here. Um,
Cool. Let's
yeah,
do
if you
it.
come to New York, yeah, I'm down.
Yeah.
Um, yeah. So people can find me on the internet. Yeah, all of my art is under Vexta, and yeah, vexta.com.au is like my art website, and my coaching is under Yvette Vexta, and that's under yvetteVexta.com. But I'm pretty easy to find. You just have to put Vexta in.
Amazing.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank
And I hope we
so
can do
much.
more. Yeah.
Definitely. Yeah, maybe I'll see you in Colorado for psychedelic science.
Yeah, maybe New York
If
before
you're
then.
around. Yeah, and if you're in New York, definitely.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's been really fun.
All right. Until next time. Thank you.
Cool. All right, bye.